So what are we doing? D&D, that's right. So my Dungeons & Dragons campaign, I've gone through a couple of things, haven't quite ever finished anything at this point in time. But my current campaign that I'm running, I have 4 of my friends playing, 4 players, and I've given it a name. It's called The Ascension of Ajax. I am a massive fan of Matt Colville. I think his stuff is amazing. His videos really great for new DMs to sort of learn the craft and sort of learn the tradition and all these interesting historical aspects about the game. And so for those of you who are familiar with his content would recognize that his BBAG, Big Bad Evil Guy, is called Saint Ajax, which I have used. I've repurposed him for my own campaign. The campaign I was running previously for a different set of friends was the Chain of Calidor. Now that obviously is another reference to Matt Colville's presently ongoing stream, The Chain. Now that other campaign unfortunately fizzled out due to some scheduling conflicts. Uni at the time was quite hectic, getting everyone together was a bit of a hassle, and coronavirus hit and sort of really cemented this isn't happening anymore. But during that time, I started a second campaign with another group of friends. Initially, this was not going to be a very serious thing. It wasn't going to be long form. It was sort of allowing for this other group of friends to have the opportunity to play a little bit. And it sort of developed from, now the first couple of sessions I established was a sort of Witcher-style monster hunt. I've been watching the Witcher TV series, and I was very excited. I really liked the idea of going into a strange town and something has been hunting and killing the townspeople, but no one knows what. And so I came across the idea of using a werewolf. Werewolves are a staple fantasy monster, and so I thought, I'd really love for this to be a werewolf hunt. So I took the town of Orlane from Against the Cult of Reptile God, one of the great classic AD&D modules, and I simply took it and I placed it into my homebrew world. Now Orlane is plagued by sort of just terrible things that constantly happen to it. One of my players, which we'll talk about a little later down the track, is playing a cleric who originates sort of his based around Orlane, and I've sort of told him, you can do what you can to improve the town, but really, Orlane is going to be terrible. The people are going to suffer. It has this strange, not even supernatural curse, it just has like the worst luck that you can possibly imagine. I was very excited to use this werewolf and have this really interesting werewolf hunt. A couple of things I had to do. We started at level 5, because I think that's a great place to start. It's sort of one of the first big power bumps. Fighters get their second attack, spellcasters will get their 3rd level spells. It's a good place, I think, for at least experienced players or for people who just don't like the slog of low level play. So I started this campaign at 5th level. We had 2 characters at the very beginning. One character was a high elf gunslinger named Bell. The other was a gnome monk named Grok. Now, at the second session, we had a 3rd person who was interested in playing, and so we introduced their character, Ferops, the tiefling wild magic sorcerer. And through a series of events, I killed off Grok. This is not intentional. I think a lot of DMs will be in the situation where they realize a fight is stacked very fairly against the players. In this instance, it was a very large group of ghouls and ghasts. Grok was a Way of the Drunken Master monk, and so Grok is sort of, his thing is moving in and out of combat, sort of going in between foes. Now in D&D, what you can sort of do in a turn with your actions, bonus actions, and reactions is referred to as the action economy. It is incredibly dangerous for a player character to be surrounded by more than a single enemy, because they are going to have more actions, more abilities, more things that they can do, while it may only be extra attacks. Those extra attacks are really going to weigh down on that player character. Now, in this instance, Grok was surrounded by at least 4 or 5 ghouls. Ghouls have a paralyzing touch ability, which means that if Grok fails his saving throw, he is paralyzed. Now, paralyzed is a very deadly condition because all attacks against a paralyzed creature have advantage, and all successful attacks are automatically a critical. Now, this obviously isn't an ideal situation, particularly when a player has invested so much time and energy in coming up with backstory and really rich world building and lore for this character. Fortunately, I did have a backup. Now, this isn't traditionally how you would reintroduce a second character or just a new character in general, but I did have a high-level NPC cleric who I was going to be using to help the party sort of as a release valve in case they needed any extra aid or any sort of extra information about werewolves hunting and sort of just adventuring in general. So I took this player aside, I apologized for killing his character, and I said to him, hey, I have this high-level cleric who's level 5, just like you guys are. You could run him if you want for this session. Now, he agreed to it. This cleric was a cleric of light. His name was Tull. Light clerics are very combat-focused clerics. They have a lot of great spells, in particular Fireball, which is the greatest spell in Dungeons & Dragons, I would say. So this player happily took over the mantle of Tull. This was initially going to be just for this session. However, afterwards, we sort of decided that this character is quite great. Let's keep him. After Tull was introduced, there was a series of events, various encounters, combat and social, which finally resulted in the death of this werewolf. Now, after the werewolf hunt, they had a bunch more different adventures, and at the end of the latest adventure that they concluded, which involved the hunting down of a mind flayer which had burrowed its way out of the Underdark, they engaged in a brief bit of downtime. They all have strongholds from Strongholds and Followers book, so they spent a few months relaxing, doing various things. Ferox was tending a bar at his tavern, the Come Right Inn. Belle was tinkering away, building new guns at her blacksmithery that she opened in Orlane, and Tull was trying to do what he can to help the people of Orlane sort of set up an oligarchy or some form of government after the events of the werewolf hunt resulted in the mayor and quite a lot of the townspeople being murdered. Several plot threads were handed out, and the one they seemed to bite on was the town of Innsfield was slaughtered by werewolves. I think, having fought a werewolf in the first couple of sessions, they probably thought there's some sort of connection. They decided that this was the most important thing, and it is. So they decided to go and research it, which is where our current adventure, which I have called Werewolves in Ergon, is currently taking place. Now, they met with Valatus, the headmaster of the Royal College of Sorcery, who seemed to be a little different than a couple of weeks ago when he first informed Ferox of the werewolf attack. They also met Benji Tides Cannibalen the 11th, a researcher at the Royal College of Sorcery who seemed to have quite an abundance of information to dump onto them. He believed that the werewolves were a product of the Handlers, a very ancient evil organization that sort of did evil for the highest bidder, essentially, causing and sowing chaos throughout the world. Now, they've encountered a handler before, after they left Orlane to try and find this wizard who appeared to have information about the first werewolf, and they sort of had an idea that handler is bad news. Benji presented several ideas and theories as to what the handlers were doing. One particularly valuable theory or idea that he presented was that the handlers were looking for an artifact known as the Chain of the Unbroken. Now, the Chain of the Unbroken, he explained, was connected to a very ancient and powerful evil being who he named the Undying King. The Undying King is a powerful spellcaster able to cast 10th level spells and higher. In my game, the Royal College of Sorcery has sort of figured out this meta-knowledge and understanding that there are different levels of power for spells, different spell levels, and that you can cast lower level spells a bit easier, a bit more frequently, and sort of decided on the term spell slots. This is just to help combat a bit of metagaming and just to make them feel like it's not so weird to talk about, spell levels and spell slots and these other game mechanics as their characters. Those of you who engage in a lot of D&D or just know a lot about the game, you might have already guessed who the Undying King. If so, don't say anything. So naturally, after gathering supplies, receiving adequate information, the first point of call for the party was to go to the town of Innsfield. They arrived. Innsfield was a rather small town, a sort of crossing over town that people would stop over and rest in between going from Ergon to other cities or travelling to Ergon. Now, Innsfield had a very small population, around 100 or so, and when they arrived in the town, they found the entire place to be deserted. This wasn't due to people leaving the town, this was due to werewolves having slaughtered the entire town. When they arrived, they found several ghouls, which was very worrying for one player who had lost his character previously, and several werewolves. One werewolf in particular, which had a different sort of patterning in its fur, which I described as very regal looking. Now, this werewolf, along with several others, left and got the heck out of town, and the party was faced with a few of the werewolves left, as well as some of the ghouls. With a particularly clever use of the cleric's turn undead, they were able to very quickly take care of the werewolves. After the fight, they rested. Bell did a bit of searching around the town. Ferox did some scouting ahead to see where the werewolves were heading towards, and found a warehouse district a couple of days' travel away that he could sort of vaguely see. He has very good eyesight, which he presumed was where the werewolves are going. So after they rested up and recouped their energy, they headed off traveling. This is where I'm going to present a really great lesson to Dungeon Masters, which is know what your player characters are carrying on them and what they have and what they can use. And I don't just mean their sort of class features and everything, although your players should be most familiar with what they can do. But I'm also talking about inventory items or loot that you've given out or haphazardly sort of thrown at the party. Now, in this warehouse district, I prepared one of the warehouses which is owned by House Ergon, the noble house which controls the city of Ergon. They have been receiving shipments of firearms and black powder from the noble house Venture, which is sort of the one place that is currently producing firearms on a larger scale than simple artificers or gunslingers such as Bell. Now, I did not think, and I did not remember that in a previous adventure I had given the party as loot about 4 or so barrels of miner's black powder, which was used by dwarves to help blow away sections of rock deep underground to help them create new caverns, mine shafts, etc. Now, this miner's black powder was a lot more unrefined than the black powder that would be typically used in firearm production, and because of that, it was a lot more volatile and a lot more deadly. What they had decided to do was to set up the black powder barrels at the front of the warehouse and use Bell's amazing sharpshooter skills to explode them and destroy the warehouse. Now, I did not think of this. I did not think of them using what, in hindsight, is a very obvious way of dealing with this warehouse. So they created essentially a tactical nuke, which destroyed the warehouse. A few werewolves did survive, and there was some combat, but they were able to take care of the werewolves pretty handily. They discovered a mostly burnt ledger which detailed the imports and exports from this warehouse. However, they realized that it was in code and they were not able to understand what the heck was being written in it. Fortunately, in a couple of warehouses over, as this is a warehouse district, there was a group of gnome artificers who were fighting a fire which had spread from this massive explosion over to their warehouse. Now, the players were able to help out. The warehouse district is right on the beach, so they had easy access to the ocean, and they met an artificer who remains nameless at the moment, who promised to give them a translation, or at least decode the ledger, in about a week's time. Satisfied with this, the players continued on and they headed to the city of Ergon. When they arrived in the city of Ergon, they found themselves in the Dragon's Hoard Inn, which was in the slums of the city, which seemed to be the only place really that they could find any shelter that wasn't rife with either other people, homeless, or others. And this is where I introduced the 4th player character in my party, Corvus Black, the warlock and consummate detective. Now, I had to think of how I would integrate this new character's story into the party's current dynamic and current goals. How could I get this new player to be as invested in the story as the current players? So the way that I did this was I simply pushed their two stories together. Corvus Black is currently on a case. He is a detective after all, and he is investigating a series of very grisly murders. A lot of the people of the city of Ergon, particularly in the slums, are being brutally murdered, leaving very large claw marks across the chest. Sounds like a werewolf, doesn't it? Corvus Black's investigation had led him also to the Dragon's Hoard Inn, and I found that a very easy way to get two groups of people to sort of either like each other or at least trust each other is to become allied in combat. Now, one thing about my world is that tieflings are sort of extremely oppressed. They do not enjoy, they're not trusted by humans, they're not trusted by elves. Generally, tieflings have it pretty hard in the world. Now, Ferox is not a stranger to this. He also found out during his downtime in Rust that the Rescatan Empire is calling out a draft for all tieflings in the region of Andrim, which is where our campaign is set in, to be drafted into a war that they are currently fighting with the world below, with the Drow. Now, Ferox is aware of this and very wisely typically dons a hat of disguise to keep him sort of not looking like a very obvious target. Now, he did so when he entered the Dragon's Hoard Inn, and he noticed that sitting on one of the tables was a group of Rescatan blade singers. Blade singers are sort of martial characters that also have magic capabilities. They're very annoying and very hard to deal with. Now, he recognized them, and they were able to eventually see through the Hat of Disguise. Now, Hat of Disguise casts the spell Disguise Self. After close enough scrutiny, you can see through it if you are familiar with the spell, and it would be presumed that the Blade Singers would be very familiar with particularly such a low-level magic spell. Now, after he was discovered, a fight quickly broke out. The Blade Singers seemed to be under the impression that they were going to bring Ferox in, so to speak, but that he would die in the war anyway, so may as well kill him now. So a fight broke out. The 4 players went up against 5 Blade Singers. They did a fair amount of damage. The Blade Singers had quite high armor and they were quite difficult to hit. However, certain characters, such as Bell, who seemed to never miss when needed, or Tull, who seems to get critical hits and do a whopping 73 points of damage on top of a critical hit and a 3rd level smite, they were able to pretty handily take care of the Blade Singers. After the fight happened, a group of Ergonian paladins, which are sort of my answer to what would a police force be like in a medieval city, came and they did some investigating. Corvus has a friend on the police force, as all good detectives do, and this paladin gave him a tip. He told him to go to the morgue. Now, of course, Corvus, being a consummate detective, is familiar with the morgue, he's familiar with the medical examiner, so to speak, who was another tiefling named Damasius. After receiving this tip, they decided to head back to Corvus Black's apartment to have a long rest, help recuperate and restore their vitality before going off to the morgue. At the morgue, they discovered that several of the Ergonian paladin bodies had intellect devourers inside, revealing potentially something sinister in the House Ergon. They also discovered, while at Corvus Black's, a very large evidence wall. So that is where we ended the session. Now, Ergon has 3 big political sort of factions that are fighting for power. We have House Ergon, which is mostly a human house. We have House Karg, which is a dwarven house. They seem to be focused mostly on their exploits and adventures in the Underdark. And we have the Daciana family. Now, the Daciana family appears to have only propped up in the last couple of centuries ago, and they've become a very big problem for House Ergon. They run several casinos and urseries, and it seems that a lot of their money is being taken from where Ergon would normally be receiving it. This is obviously a big issue. Now, in the morgue, after defeating the intellect devourers, they discovered 3 strange swashbuckler-looking characters wearing black hoods with carrying flintlock pistols and rapiers. These swashbucklers appeared to be cornering and threatening a man who Ferox had, in his investigation at Corvus's apartment, recognized as Silvio Daciana, one of the sons of the Daciana family. Corvus Black has unearthed several rumours that Lord Milvio Daciana, the sort of head of the Daciana family, is a werewolf, but has sort of dismissed these ideas because they come from mostly kids or drunks who don't really know anything. However, coupled with the sort of general information that they know about Ergon and the werewolf attacks, and coupled with the fact that the swashbucklers said, the boss said Silver will do, when pointing their weapons at Silvio Daciana, seems to indicate that perhaps Silvio too is a werewolf. Now that's where we left off that session. That was last night on Sunday. It seems like we're playing sort of fortnightly, so there's going to be another update video when that session is done. I hope you enjoyed this. I really enjoyed talking about my D&D campaign. It's sort of a weird thing. I'm not exactly writing a story. It's sort of, collaborative storytelling, which is what D&D basically is. So if you enjoyed this, do all the usual YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell button if you want to get notifications for more videos. You guys know what to do. I don't need to say this at the end. I feel like I sort of do. But I'll hopefully see you again soon.